Okay, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. May I have your attention, please? Quiet, please. Thank you very much. All right. So here we go. Continue on with the civil rights movement. We're going to be looking into episode 4, A No Easy Walk, 1961, 1963. Go ahead, have your notes out. It's on page 2. We're going to be looking at the continued efforts of the civil rights movement and the latest things that are going to be taking place in the states of Georgia and Alabama and Washington, D.C. So we're going to be going all over the place here. Where we left off last time, we had some success for the civil rights organizers with getting segregation policies removed in many communities. And as far as lunch counters, we finally had, even after they took quite a beating, we had the Freedom Riders ultimately get success in getting the Interstate Commerce Commission under the leadership of the Kennedys, President John F. Kennedy and his brother, Attorney General Robert Kennedy, and getting them to ban segregation in interstate transportation facilities and on buses and so forth. So what about it? Is this going to be like one victory after another victory after another? Is it just going to, no, I mean, this is 1961. I mean, remember I told you there's going to be like segregation going on throughout the 1960s. This is still going. So what we're going to see today is some interesting challenges taking place with respect to some of the different communities, and they're going to be pushing the effort. Sometimes you get some success in kind of outside the Deep South. You know, we had Tennessee, which is not deep South. You had the Nashville mayor, Ben West, ultimately going along with anti-segregation policies. Previously, the 1950s, Arkansas, you had Little Rock. I mean, it was their school board that was starting to bring in integration. But we're going to see the civil rights movement taking the effort right into the heart of the deep South. And having some success, but also running into some challenges as well. And we're going to see that the opponents of the civil rights movement are going to be redoubling their efforts, okay? So in fact, let's go ahead and actually start this episode. And there he is, okay? I shared with you, I think I shared with you my picture of George Wallace. George Wallace, you can go ahead and write this down. George Wallace was elected in the fall of 1962, and then took the oath of office in 1963, and is probably going to be one of the most well-known politicians as far as segregation. I mean, he gives his speech, segregation now, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever. He is all about segregation. I mean, even though he knows that, you know, the federal government can get integration into the University of Alabama, remember that from the Forrest Gump movie? And he stands in front of the doorway, you know, to send the message that he's against it and so forth. Yes, he is going to be, at that time, the poster child for, or the poster politician for segregation. He'll have a change of heart, ultimately, by the mid to late part of the 1970s. But at this time, he's all about segregation. And in Alabama, I mean, man, that was the place. Remember the city of Montgomery, where the Freedom Riders got beat up badly because they didn't have proper protection, and civil rights leaders in various different places, including Birmingham. You can write this down. They call it Bombingham. You see, I put that in your notes. Bombingham, because of all the civil rights leaders and so forth that are targeted with bombs, homemade bombs. You know, people are trying to kill them. I mean, this is crazy. Yeah. Reverend Fred Shuttlesworth, go ahead and make sure you've got him in the situation there. Reverend Fred Shuttlesworth, he's over here in the far left in this picture. You see Martin Luther King Jr. right here. There's Ralph Abernathy. So these are all leaders of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, civil rights organizers. We've got a lot of like leading Christians from African-American community that are pushing for change, right? They're pushing for change. And we're going to see the story turn very, very importantly in this particular episode to Birmingham, Alabama. That ain't Ben West. That is not a leader who is like, oh yeah, sure, you know, we'll work with the African American leaders. No, this is going to be Eugene Connor, known as Bull Connor. And we're going to see in this episode how he is really an intransigent force in favor of segregation and in charge of law enforcement for a while there in Birmingham, Alabama. It's going to get quite interesting. So we'll look at that as we go forward. Now, sometimes it's very interesting as you go through here because there's a lot of lessons to be learned. And frankly, if you're trying to get people to change their views, whether it's you know, the effort to get same-sex marriage in, effort to get transgender rights and so forth, they look back on the template from the civil rights movement. What worked? What didn't work? You know, one of the things you have to have, though, is clearly you have to have thought through things very carefully, and you need to be organized. And this is important. Write this down. We're going to in this episode, we're going to be talking about the difficulties in 1961 in a city called Albany, Georgia. And in the city of Albany, Georgia, there's going to be what is called the Albany movement. Civil rights, local leaders, in concert with some of the students from SNCC, okay, Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and then also at times with SLIC, right, the older pastors, including Martin Luther King Jr. and so forth. They're going to be trying to get some changes in Albany, Georgia. And they're motivated. I mean, they come together and they sing songs and they do prayers and they hear speeches, and they've got all kinds of folks that are willing to get involved and to protest and to get arrested and so forth. And yet, it's not met with the same kind of success that we've seen in some of the other protest movements in Nashville or in Montgomery with the bus boycott. And why is that? I mean, watch this very carefully. This is very interesting. And I think it's very interesting because the leader of the Albany movement, he talks about how he's trying to sort of like, you know, hit them here and hit them there and get their attention and so forth. And, you know, I tell you what, though, the person who is going to be the key figure on the other side enforcing the laws, the segregationist laws and so forth, on the other side is going to be a very interesting figure. Lori Pritchett, he's the chief of police. Watch how he handles this situation. You got a picture right here. You got Ralph Abernathy, you got Martin Luther King Jr., and then you got Lori Pritchett right there. And one of the things I think is going to jump out at you during this particular phase is that Pritchett is very thoughtful. He is not one whose temper rises up very quickly, and he's very thoughtful. So, for example, he'll tell you, he knows that one of the strategies Martin Luther King Jr. and other civil rights leaders have is to make sure that they bring in plenty of folks, right? You're going to have lots of folks gathering at the churches, and then when they have their protests, they know they're going to be arrested and they're going to be in the jails, and there's just not enough room in the jails, right? Lori Pritchett knows the strategy, and so that his jail facility in Albany, Georgia is not overcrowded, so he has to let him go. He communicates with his leaders or other sheriffs and other law enforcement folks that have jails in neighboring communities, and as his jail starts to get filled up in Albany, he transports them. He moves them out. He moves into local jails. So his Albany jail never gets overcrowded. So the goal of having to have, you know, people released because of overcrowding doesn't happen, right? And of course, one of the difficulties you get as you go through this, and you guys know this, you know, people need jobs. They need to earn money. They need to be able to pay for this, that, so forth, and so on. And so if you have young adults or any, you know, adults, workers that are willing to get arrested, you know, great. But how much money did they earn while they're sitting in jail for, you know, however many days? Like nothing. And do you have enough money collected and raised in order to help pay the bills for the family members of the people who were put in jail? I mean, you got to have that. It's part of your organizational thing. And you can raise that money from all over the country, all over the world. But if you don't, then you're going to start putting pressure, and the families and the participants who get themselves jailed are going to really feel a pinch. And that was what was taking place in Albany. And you get some criticism going back and forth. You know, you get more attention when Martin Luther King Jr. comes in to give a speech and so forth. But then the attention dies down when he's gone, and he gives advice to the leaders in Albany, and they don't always want to follow the advice. So there's some tensions. Not just big monolithic. Everyone agrees with everyone on how it's supposed to go forward, but it doesn't quite work out as well. I mean, you have and even in one situation, they're like when he's in Albany, King gets himself thrown in jail. Pritchett doesn't want King in his jail. I mean, he's like, well, I'm not going to pay the fine. Well, somebody paid the fine. Pritchett made sure that somebody paid the fine because he didn't want to have King in his jail, and he got King out of his jail, and that was it. Out of a 45-day jail sentence that King had for illegally protesting and so forth, he spent 3 days, and he moved on, and he got back together with his folks. I mean, and of course, as you know, King and the others on behalf of Albany, they're putting pressure on President Kennedy to do this, that, and so forth, and intervene. And it's not working out so well. Okay, so it was a setback. The leaders of the civil rights movement, particularly King and others in the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, the pastors and so forth, they're like, okay, we need a victory. Albany did not work out as well for us. We weren't able to put the pieces together that we need to sustain a big victory. And of course, one of the things they're really pushing for is to get the rest of the country and elected congressional leaders from the rest of the country to enact a civil rights law that will make it clear from the federal government's point of view that you can't have these kinds of segregation going on in areas that are open to the public, whether it's movie theaters or, obviously schools and so forth. You got courts coming in, but can you get Congress to do it? One of the things that's going to take place in the early 1960s is you are going to see pressure in the United States Senate to get rid of the filibuster, or at least change the rules of the filibuster, because Southern segregation senators were able to kill civil rights legislation just by filibustering it to death, and they only needed a handful. So you will see a change on that. But King and the others are going to be putting pressure on those members of Congress and public opinion from the rest of the country, from the West, the Rocky Mountain West, the Midwest, the Northeast. What do you need to do in order to get people to pay attention to what's really going on in the Deep South? You have, Pritchard, who's just like this nice old guy, and he's putting people in jail and so forth. Well, that doesn't sort of ruffle too many feathers. I mean, it ruffles the feathers of the people who are getting arrested, but they're like, the next thing is right here. You can see it right there. 1963, civil rights leaders are going to embark on what's called Project C. C as in confrontation. And there's going to be times when you're going to have, more moderate leaders and so forth. They're going to say, just slow down, we'll get this, we'll do this, and so forth. Civil rights leaders are like, no, we're going to be in confrontation. Now, we're not going to beat anybody up, but we've identified as a leader of the Birmingham community, Bull Connor, somebody who is going to make their side look really, really bad to the news media, to the people, and we're willing to go through some pretty rough times in order to show the value and the worth of our cause. So they got it all planned out, and this is going to be quite interesting how this plays out. Okay, Birmingham. Early on in the Birmingham project, right, the conference, C for confrontation, King gets arrested. He is in protest and he's arrested. And actually, it's interesting because he's like, some of the most important pieces of literature written in jail. There was a letter that came out, or an editorial that came out in the newspaper in Birmingham criticizing King, and it was written by many of the white pastors from the Birmingham area, basically saying, we agree with you that there are some things that need to be changed, but you're moving too fast, and you should really slow things down, and you're being too confrontational. And King writes one of his most important written pieces, The Letter from a Birmingham Jail, where he basically is saying, when people tell me wait, it sounds like so many of the words wait throughout the history of African Americans in this country. And wait tends to translate into it's never going to happen. No more waiting. The right thing to do is to get things done now. And King says in his letter, he is going to continue to push for change, not later, but now in this lifetime. And they've got a plan, right? They've got a plan. Fred Shuttlesworth is going to play a key role as a local pastor in the Birmingham area. And it's very interesting. They've got it all kind of figured out. They're going to have protests, they're going to have boycotts, they're going to have marches, they're going to march, 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 and they're going to confront, and they're going to go where they need, and they're not going to be violent. I mean, who could pull this off? I mean, if you don't want to have too many people thrown in jail and out of work and no money coming, you know, to your families and so forth to pay the bills, how do you do that? I mean, think about it. Who's going to do the protesting? Kids. This is a really interesting tactic. Kids. I mean, they've got things to do during the day. You know, if they get thrown into juvenile detention facilities and so forth, they can't go to school. And yet, you're going to have, at the height of it, you know, hundreds. I think on one day you had like 700 kids, school kids, you know, young kids like these ones, and high school age kids and so forth. And they're going to be joining into the protest, and they're going to be the main bulk of the protest. And, you know, and they get, I mean, it's fascinating because the kids don't, and the African American kids, they don't show up to school to ride the buses. And then when the police arrest them all, guess what mode of transportation they use to take them to a detention facility? Yeah, the school bus. I mean, imagine going on a school bus, and it's like going to jail. I'm sure you can't even fathom that. So you do have this, you know, the kids that are doing this, and it gets a lot of attention. It's like kids are willing to do this and so forth, and a lot of pressure. And of course, Bull Connor is getting pretty irritated because these protests are going day after day after day. And his law enforcement folks are not getting time off. I mean, they're having to come in and do overtime and so forth. And Connor's like, I don't know, think about it. All right. What are the kinds of methods that are done, that are used on the part of the community to make sure that these African Americans do not try and change things around? Brute force. I mean, you got the KKK that are doing all kinds of sneaky things and off here, there, and in the sides and so forth. And but what about the police themselves? Would they resort to it? Would they resort to, like, you know, really improper means of dealing with these protest march? I mean, they're just going to round up the kids and nice peacefully load them up in the school buses, I mean, detention buses and so forth? Or is there going to be some other reaction? Well, I think it's not that much of a surprise to see what Bull Connor ultimately does. And it's not that much of a surprise. It's a bit scary. But here are some of the images that ultimately did come out of Birmingham, right? The police with dogs, you know, attacking peaceful protesters. And the news media is there. And the cameras are there. And it's in the newspapers. And it's on the television. This is before you had a million channels like you do now. And you have, you know, the internet and cable and streaming. And I mean, there was like 3 news channels, and everyone watched the news at night, and that's what they were watching. Oh, and they brought in the fire department. There's no fire, but they used the fire hoses to, like, beat back the folks with the high pressure fire hoses, these folks who were protesting. That's what's going on in the news. And it turns very badly for Bull Connor and the white leaders in Birmingham. Now, it's very interesting because you've got, yeah, here's your news coverage. Yeah, this is Detroit. Dogs, fire hoses, quell, huge new race march. This is, again, this is in 1963, in the spring of 1963. And, you know, you're getting international coverage. I mean, this is making the United States look really bad. I mean, when you get communist countries that are saying, oh, yeah, right, everyone complains about us, but look what they're doing in America. I mean, look, here are the images. Are you kidding me? So it's interesting because here's a guy, you'll see them in the movie, David Vann. He's a Birmingham white politician, a moderate, And he's like, can't we come up with some kind of a deal here, to kind of move things along here and so forth. And the African American community kind of, digs in their heels and says, we need real big changes, none of this little incremental kind of stuff and so forth. Um, and ultimately, I mean, this is what is playing out in Birmingham is playing not to just the folks in Alabama, it's playing to the larger scene. And implicitly, there's pressure on President Kennedy, again, to do something. What do they want him to do? What do they want the leadership in Congress to do? They want him to put forth a civil rights bill, a new civil rights bill. And they want changes in the Senate so it will get through the Senate and not get filibustered to death. Get through the House. Will that civil rights bill come through? There you go. Kennedy announces a civil rights bill on the 11th of June, 1963. See that? Okay. And he announces it on television. And so we're going to see Kennedy, starting to put things together to get that bill through. It takes a little while. It takes some time, for legislation to get through Congress. But it ultimately will happen. And so that is a victory. I mean, you have violence and bad news coverage. And King's hotel room they were staying. Yeah, write that down. That got bombed too, the motel that he was staying in. In the meantime, as you go into the summer of 1963, right? So the Birmingham effort, Project C, was a success for the civil rights movement, right? They were able to get enough political pressure to get things moving in Congress with the president and so forth. And almost in a celebratory fashion, they put together a march on Washington. And this is very, very fascinating, right? So you've got a peaceful protest, Washington, D.C., August 28th, 1963, right? You got people coming in from all over the country, particularly the South, but you got African Americans and white Americans and so forth coming in to protest. 200,000 people gathered there. This is looking out, this picture is taken from the vantage point of the Lincoln Memorial, looking out over to the reflection pond, looking toward the Washington Monument. And of course, it's from this area that you have King giving his speech. There you can see, and others giving very important speeches. And there's a lot of interesting tension because people are like, is this going to be a big violent protest? It's like, no, these guys aren't going to have a big violent protest. I mean, the worst thing you're going to have out of it is to see at the end of the movie is that they got a lot of things organized, sandwiches and news coverage. And they didn't have a cleanup crew organized very well. There's a lot of trash that's left. And, future marches in Washington, D.C. don't want to get bad publicity. So you make sure you clean up the mess. But I mean, this is a highlight for the civil rights movement, right? They're able to pull off a very, very high profile, positive protest that's peaceful. And I mean, there is a little bit of behind the scenes tension. Make sure you follow this very carefully in the video. John Lewis, one of the young leaders of the SNCC, he's giving a speech, and in his speech, he wants to actually criticize Kennedy for going too slow. And the older leaders of the civil rights movement are like, it's just like not criticize. He's our ally right now, So they prevail upon him to tone his speech down a little bit. But probably the most important speech and most memorable speech from that day is the I Have a Dream speech from Martin Luther King Jr. And click, you're going to see part of it in the video, Eyes on the Prize. But I've got a link up here and I'll put it in Google Classroom as well. Watch the whole thing. It's powerful. It's positive. It's just like, he does a real good job of communicating very effectively. I'm not going to try and put that into my video because I don't want to get copyrighted. But go ahead and click on that links separately and watch. It goes on for what, maybe 10 or 15 minutes total, and it's stirring. Okay, so check that out. A big victory wow, I mean, it's like, wow, this is a really positive episode, except for the dogs and the fire hoses and so forth. I mean, we don't got anybody dead, you know, as a result of this. And of course, you got this great thing in Washington, D.C. I mean, my gosh, this is pretty cool. And I no, I wasn't there. I was alive, right? I mean, I was like 2 weeks old, not even 2 weeks old when this speech was given. I was born in August 13, 1963. And yeah, so, I mean, is that it? Everything's going to be cool? Right. Way to go. So let's turn our attention back to, yeah, there we go. There it is. The 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham, Alabama. That was where that Fred Shuttlesworth and the others would give their sermons and their speeches, and they'd come together and they'd rally. And in fact, from these steps right here, you would have the students march toward downtown Birmingham. And it's actually across the street where you saw some of the, well, you'll see some of the images of the fire hoses on the students. And it's not quite as dangerous then because they're quite at some distance. When they get real close up, it's very, very dangerous having a fire hose on you. But yeah, there it is, 16th Street Baptist Church, Birmingham, Alabama. All right. I mean, it's like, you know, what do they do typically on a Sunday? Well, let me see. What was it? September 15th, 1963. That was a Sunday. You have a service, and before that you have like people gathering, and in fact there's a bunch of kids that are gathering before the service, and unbeknownst to them, some real jerks had placed a bomb and blew up the Birmingham 16th Street Baptist Church. 4 little girls were killed, others were brutally injured. This happened on September 15th, 1963, and they were killed. By who? Well, in the film, it's very interesting because when the film came out, Eyes on the Prize, what was this, made in 1987? And I always give updates as to what the situation was, because in 1987, I mean, there was suspicion, the federal government was down there investigating and so forth. It's like, who's, can you think of who might be behind like bombing a church that's associated with the civil rights movement? The KKK. Yep. And ultimately, finally, over many years, people were held to account. There their names are. You can write them down. Robert Chambliss, Thomas Blanton, Bobby Frank Cherry, KKK members in Alabama. Robert Chambliss, he was the first one convicted in 1977, and he was sentenced to life in prison. This is a lot different from the Emmett Till case. Things are starting to change, although notice this, it was 1977 conviction when the attack took place, what, 14 years earlier. There's no statute of limitations on murder. So when the authorities finally do get the information, they will act on it. Thomas Blanton, his conviction didn't come until the year 2001. And he was also sentenced to life in prison for his role in the terrorist attack against the 16th Street Baptist Church. And then Bobby Frank Cherry, he was convicted in the year 2002, and he was sentenced to life in prison. So there is a cost, and there will be others that will pay as a result of this very, very difficult and important period. So yeah, I mean, I'd like to leave it. Well, there is kind of a positive thing. If you were to go, there's the 16th Street Baptist Church. If you were to go to Birmingham, Alabama today, you'll see the right kitty corner. In fact, this corner right here backs up against the park right across the street. They have a memorial. I'll put the link here to a really, really cool story about how this memorial sculpture piece came into existence, reflecting the lives of the 4 girls that were killed on that day. Very, very cool. I know I'm looking forward to, and when I retire, to going and visiting the Deep South and going to a number of various different places. And that's one of the places on my list, is to go to Birmingham and to go to this very spot. So yeah, very, very important piece of history. And I'm going to wrap it up right here. Click on Watch Eyes on the Prize. Make sure you have a real good understanding of that. You've got the notes from here. Yep. And you guys be safe, and I'll see you later.